Hello, this is Mrs. Baker. I'm just going to show you the concept of economies of scale. Now, it's very important in the long run when businesses get bigger, which is what scale means, that they can get their average cost down. If you think about what that means, if they can get their average cost down, it means that they can make more profit, because any revenue that they get in, they'll be taking less average cost from it, and therefore they'll be able to make more profit, which gives them all sorts of opportunities in the long run. So what we've got here is a long run average cost curve. That's this big U-shaped curve here. And that's showing us that as you increase the amount of output that a firm makes in the long run, then the average cost of making that output falls. So at this point, the average cost is here. And at this point, the average cost is here. And eventually we get to this point, Q1, where we've made the average costs as low as possible. And that's really good for the firm's profitability. We can call that point here, where the average costs have fallen as low as possible in the long run, the minimum efficient scale. It's the minimum scale of output that the firm needs to get to in order to get its average cost down as low as possible. Okay, so we call that process of the firm gradually reducing its average costs so that it can make more and more output at a lower and lower average cost per unit. We call that process economies of scale. It means, it gets cheaper to produce on a larger scale. So an example of that might be if you're a really big firm and you need lots of inputs. Let's say you need oil, you need labour, you need other raw materials, then purchasing those things is going to be much cheaper for you because you're going to be able to buy them in bulk. So if you buy things in bulk, you're probably going to get a better price for them from your suppliers, and that's going to bring your average cost down. So that process there of economies of scale helps our average cost in the long run to fall all the way to here. But then you can see that average cost starts to rise again as output continues to increase. Now what is that? That's called diseconomies of scale. And the definition of that is that your average costs start to rise again as you increase your output. And that's because of things like as companies get bigger and bigger, their communication can get poor. Maybe they can have strikes. People who are in big multinational firms, they start to feel kind of disconnected to their colleagues in other countries. They don't work so well together. And that process increases average costs, and therefore they start to rise again. So we don't want to get to that point. We want to get economies of scale, and we want output to increase and average cost to fall right up to the minimum efficient scale. And then on this diagram, we don't want to get the firm any bigger than that, because then the average cost will start to rise again. Now you're probably wondering what those other three little U-shaped curves are. That links this idea to the short run cost curves that you've been studying. So here's a short run average cost curve. So you've been studying those in micro with Ms. Rogers, and that shows that the average cost of production there in that short run is quite high and the level of output is quite low. If we can move into the long run, where all factors of production are flexible, then we can move to a new short run average cost curve, where average costs have got a bit better. So move from here to here, and average costs have fallen to here and output's increased. And if we then move to a third short run, then we can get our average cost lower, and that's going to be at a high level of output. That's the average cost curve in the long run is called the envelope curve, because it's like an envelope that includes all these short run average cost curves. And you might be thinking, well, why are these little U-shaped curves there? The answer is that each little U-shaped curve in the short run is experiencing the law of diminishing returns. They make all the changes that they can to get more efficient, but they're constrained by one of their fixed factors of production. So they've got to move from the short run into the long run, and then they can reduce the cost again, and then they increase again, law of diminishing returns, because they're constrained by one of their fixed factors of production. So they make some changes and they move to a new short run, and so on. So the law of diminishing returns is a short run concept, which is then contained by this long run average cost curve, and the process for the long run average cost curve is called economies of scale, and it's all about reducing business costs so that they can get them as low as possible on average, so that they can make as much profit as possible.